All right. Everybody good this morning? Everybody good? Okay. All right. Well, hopefully we'll be able to finish this chapter today. It's been several Sundays we've been in chapter 7, but there's just a lot of material in it, a lot of confusion that goes with it, and even when we get down towards the end of this section, we're going to deal with another part of it where a lot of brethren try to make something and bind something that they really have no position that they can bind. But as we said, that's one of the points that we're making as we're looking at Paul writing this letter, is that even though he's writing by inspiration and the brethren that he's writing to are able to work miraculous gifts, they still have a misunderstanding about some of the things that Paul's writing. And that's the reason why he's having to write these follow-up letters and dealing with these questions. So as we said, through this section, Paul is discussing things that the Lord had said, verse 10. Paul is giving apostolic commands, verse 17, where you have these different matters that are arising. But then you also have matters of inspirational judgment. That's in verse 26. Now, we have principles that Christ taught about marriage. You remain together. If you do end up separating, you're reconciled. Because Jesus only gave one reason for why a person could divorce and then be able to remarry, and that's by fornication. You have commands that are given of whatever calling or your situation in life actually is, whether you're single, whether you're married, or whether you're a slave. You're to remain in those so that you are able, as long as you're able to properly serve God. Now, if you have a situation where, let's say you're married and your mate wants to leave, they're not a believer, then what about that situation?
You can let her go.
All right, let him or her go. You're not bound to that marriage relationship to where you have to reject following Christ and being a Christian. Same thing with being a slave. If you are a slave, and let's say your master is a believer, a brother, well, there's plenty of application and teaching to show that somebody is always over somebody else, and if that's the case, then Matthew 7:12 is going to come to play. Do unto others as you have them do unto you. Well, if you have a brother that he's a member of the church, well, more than likely he would not want to be a slave to anybody else. So what are you going to do to this individual that is now your slave and he's obeyed the gospel? Well, I wouldn't want to be a slave. Why would I want him to be a slave? So you set him free. And even then, let's say you yourself are a Christian, or you become a Christian, you have all these slaves. Well, now realizing what the Bible teaches, more than likely, you would let your slaves go. Give them their freedom if they want to stay and work and labor, and you pay them what they're due, then that's fine. But if they are wanting to end up leaving, let's say they were taken against their will or whatever, then all right, you let them go and give them the opportunity to be free. Verse 23 and 24, where we closed up last time, this is the ultimate principle. You are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. No matter what our situation, no matter what the circumstance, this is what is at the forefront of our mind. Whether you're free or you're a slave, you're bought with a price. We belong to Christ, so therefore do not become the servants of men to the degree to where you end up not being able to serve God. So throughout all this context, that's ultimately what is at the the crux of this discussion. It's about being able to serve God. So then when we start the new section in verse 25, he brings up the matter of virgins. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife, seek not a wife. Now, here's this new situation, this new matter, and it's the matter concerning virgins. Now, did Jesus ever teach about this?
Virgins.
Mm-hmm. And whether they should marry or not marry or stay at home or
Well, it says he didn't.
okay. Well,
It says right in here. He just read it.
Okay.
yeah,
It-
no commandment of the Lord. So that's what Paul's discussing.
It's a trick question.
So that's the reason why there's no commandment on it. So Paul is addressing it by inspiration, and again, in view of in view of this situation, the present distress. So right here we have Paul giving us ample room. As we said, this is still in the discussion of liberties and expedience, judgment calls that we're able to make. Paul is leaving a lot of wiggle room, if you will, for these brethren to be able to make their own decisions in light of the present distress. So here is a event where the situation is going to determine what you do. Now, a lot of people don't like that. The whole idea about situational ethics. Now, there's some things, of course, situational ethics do not apply. But here is proof positive where, okay, a situation is going to determine what we're actually going to end up doing and saying is going to be allowed or not in view of this present stress. So when we're looking at it here even further, where it says, I have no commandment of the Lord, and then Paul says, yet I give my judgment, and then he says, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a person might look at this and say, well, who is Paul to give his counsel or his advice? Or they may take it a step further and just say his opinion. What gives him the right to do that?
Because he's inspired.
Okay, this is still an inspired opinion. He is authorized by the Holy Spirit to give this.
Are we allowed to skip over just a second? I wanted to see what your Bible says in verse 40.
Of the same chapter?
Yes. Because I got to thinking about that too, the exact thing that we're talking about here, because mine has these words that just are kind of funny. I just wanted to see what yours says.
7 verse 40, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God.
Okay, say that again, the end part.
And I think
Right there.
also that I have the Spirit of God.
That's what's funny to me. It's where it says, I think. I thought he should know he does. So that kind of goes along with this when he uses words like that. It's like you're inspired, but you're using words supposed and I think. Do you have any reason why he would say that? Did you know?
Well, I would think it would be the same way in which we would kind of talk to each other, and how that, okay, if somebody has, so let's say you and I are in a conversation about cabinet making, and then you say to me, is, well, and I think I know what I'm talking about. Well, it's like, okay, yeah, that would be the case. So it's a bit of the same thing here, and even in this section, verse 25, where he says, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. He is setting forth further evidence as to why they should take this into their consideration. That I'm giving you this advice, I'm giving you my judgment, and I would trust that you would consider me as being faithful to take what I'm saying. So it'd be the same thing over there in verse 40.
That makes sense.
That's going to be kind of a little bit, I guess, a little tongue-in-cheek, type of phraseology.
And it could also be said in such a way where it sounds like you're not lording it over somebody. It's more of you're bringing it down to a level where it doesn't sound like you're patting yourself on the back and I know everything.
Right.
And sometimes when you're talking to somebody, I can see it because when I talk to some people about, woodworking or whatever, I don't sit there and, oh, yes, of course I know. You say it a little bit differently.
Yeah. And definitely that's going on in this context, what you're saying, and he's going to end up saying that in just a moment, to where he's giving this advice, and it's for their profit. He's going to use that word in particular. that is for their profit, and that he's not actually trying to put extra baggage or bring them under extra bondage. And so it's, yeah, I mean, and even in this situation, Paul is having to walk on, a little bit, he's having to walk on eggshells, because one of the accusations that is being made against him is, well, when he writes, he's one way, but when he's with us, he's another way. Now, with those accusations that are going on, Paul's kind of having to jump back and forth between those two different things. To where it's like, okay, they're saying this about me in my letters, so let's kind of revamp that a little bit. So as to, kind of take away some of that edge, but we've already seen some of it back in chapter 4, where he's saying, okay, if I have to come with a rod, I'll come with a rod. And even in this letter, he's got some very pointed language still, while trying to strike up the balance, like what you're saying. To where it's just, okay, yeah, I'm an apostle, and if I wanted to, I could just come in here and just rule over all of you. But the fact remains is that even with him being an apostle, that's not how you really get people to do what they're needing to do. I mean, yeah, you can come in as a dictator and have people follow your commands or whatever, but they're doing it grudgingly. Whereas what you really need to do is come in and be able to change their minds so that they'll do it because they want to. And so even there, with what we're seeing with the apostles, is the same thing with God, and what the Calvinists get messed up on. Well, he's completely sovereign, to where he just takes us over, and those that are saved are going to do what they're supposed to do even against their own will, and those that are lost are just going to be lost, and that's against their own will. Well, that's not how God wants us to serve him. And that's the reason why he's given us free will, is because it comes through a changing of our minds to where we have a desire to do this, not just that we're being made to do it. So in dealing with this language, it's some of that, to where, like, yes, I have this authority, but I'm not just coming in and beating you over the head with it, even though he would have every right to do it. And the same thing with elders. Okay, elders have the rule, but they're not the Lord. So it's a balancing act that's having to take place.
Which you see in Philemon, which you brought up last week.
Right, exactly.
Kind of like, you should, and you owe me your soul because, I even converted you, and you know what I mean? Like, let's,
Right.
Yeah. So it's constantly this, you should just, it's a nudging.
Yeah, it's kind of bargaining.
Yeah.
A little bit. So yeah, that's this language definitely attaches over to what you're bringing up there in verse 40, and just put it all boils down to the fact that, okay, even though he is authorized to do this, he's having to allow them to exercise their judgment as to whether they're actually going to follow it or not. And so this mercy that he talks about in being able to obtain, that's in reference to how it is that he's able to be an apostle, that he saw the Lord on the way to Damascus. He received that mercy in seeing him and being told what he was needing to do instead of just being put to death. I mean, Jesus had every right to just take Paul out if he wanted to. That's Acts chapter 5 with Ananias and Sapphira. You're lying to God. You're put to death, so others will learn from it. Well, the same thing could have done with Paul, but instead received mercy, and he ends up being obedient. And again, the idea that he is faithful, that he has truly repented. He's now teaching the gospel that he once destroyed. And he's saying to the congregation, look, my faithfulness is evident to you. That I'm not doing this to build myself up or to get some type of advantage over you, but that everything that I'm doing is for your benefit. So those are the terms. So again, the pleading aspect with him. And really it is. It all boils down to matters of judgment. Now, when we're looking at this word, let's say this word distress, though we really do not have any scriptural evidence, don't really know too much about secular historical evidence as to what this distress is going to be or exactly what they're going through. But we know from what other passages have to say about things that are going on at the same time. You have Luke chapter 21, verse 23. Now, of course, this is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. So there's the same term. But Corinth is on the other side of the Mediterranean. So what is necessarily going to happen at Jerusalem is not going to be the same type of distress that they're having to worry about, though they are going to have to deal with something. And it'd be the same thing with the 7 churches of Asia that are written about in Revelation. Well, you're all the way over here in Asia. What are you having to concern yourself about with the destruction of Jerusalem? It's not just going to stay at Jerusalem. It's going to end up spreading out. And especially when you take into consideration the similarities between Judaism and Christianity, you can see how there's going to be collateral damage. And then just on top of that, the fact that Christians are not going to do what pagans are going to do. They're going to be very easy to spot. You don't go to the temple and worship like we do. So we've got to do something to put a stop to. So this distress is setting the stage for why Paul is saying the things that he's saying. So he says, if unmarried, stay so. He said that earlier. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Now again, this is just advice concerning the matter. You're about to go through a time of distress, or you are presently going through a time of distress, and that type of distress on marriage is not good. To where it's going to put you in a position where you could end up messing yourself up permanently, separating and you shouldn't separate, and somebody ends up going and doing something they shouldn't. So in that type of situation, don't seek after a wife. But the end result is, if you are married in this distress, it's not a reason for divorce or separation. And that's a big thing that needs to be drawn out from this, because there's a lot of brethren that want to try to look at this and say, well, here's Paul's reason for divorce. No, this isn't a reason for divorce. He says, come back if you're going to be reconciled to somebody. In verse 28, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. So now we're moving into further explanation as to why Paul is giving this advice. He states, if you're married, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she hath not sinned. So we have the question that's raising up, well, is it a sin to even get into this relationship? Well, of course not. Is it a sin to stay out of the relationship? No, of course not. But if you do get into this relationship, he interjects with this, nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. But he says, but I spare you. Now, earlier, I thought we were marrying so as to remove from trouble. So what's this talking about?
What you're talking about fighting and quarreling, if one's going to go this way and one's going to go that way and stuff like that.
Correct.
But last time it was over, instead of burning, be married.
Okay, so earlier it's just dealing with the fact of fornication. What about this this actual act? There's nothing wrong with it as long as it's within the confines of marriage, and it's better to marry than to burn. But now that we're moving into this situation of this present distress, now we're entering into a different kind of trouble. Because the married are going to have responsibilities that those that are single will not have. So we're going through this present distress, that will make them, the single people, actually preferred. Because you already have, we've made this point before, Paul is in Corinth. He runs into Aquila and Priscilla. Why are they in Corinth?
Persecution.
All right, persecution in Rome. They were thrown out of Rome. So whatever's going on in Rome is going to end up bleeding its way out towards Corinth and all these different places. To where having to go on the run, and if you're having to go on the run with a wife and kids, that's what Jesus said in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, what we just read a moment ago. Woe unto them that give suck, that have children, because it's going to be more difficult for you trying to get out. And that's what's being discussed here. Not that the marriage relationship is bad, it's just in the present circumstance. It'd be better to stay this way. In verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, it remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none. Now, how could this be? How could it be that a married man be as though he had none?
Is it going back to them leaving? Or what do you mean? But nothing said no. The torn is short.
Because I mean, clearly a husband is not like it's not just gonna all of a sudden strike him. It's like, oh, now I don't have a wife, or the other way for the wife to just all of a sudden, okay, it's just like amnesia or whatever. The point is, in view of the distress, the marriage is not going to have priority.
Mm-hmm. And then the marriage will suffer for it.
Right. The idea that, just like we said with those that are married, they have certain responsibilities. Guess what? In a distress, in a time of calamity, I'm not going to be able to uphold those responsibilities. And you're not going to be able to uphold your responsibilities. And the different things that you might see as being important and being need to be taken care of when we're running for our lives, those do not take precedent anymore. And certainly when it comes, above all, our responsibility to God. Now we look at this again as being a strange thing because we are so far removed from it. But these brethren, they were living every day as though it could be their last. Jews that are coming along trying to disrupt things. I mean, Saul is putting men and women in prison, pulling them out of their houses, putting them in prison, putting them to death. And then you're going to have the Gentiles who are going to be involved in the same type of practices because they don't like what Christianity is doing to their society, to their cultures, and more importantly, to their pocketbook, because they're stealing people away from the temple. And if you pull people away from the temple, they're not going to give. So you got all these situations where people are wanting to have you removed. So what do we need to make sure that both of us have our eyes on? God and the kingdom. Now in Luke chapter 14 and verse 20, we see how that this can end up being a problem. In the parable where Jesus says, or it's a king that has a son, and it's a wedding feast, and they're inviting all of these guests, and they actually go out and tell the guests to come. One of the excuses that's given, another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. Now, in this type of situation, it's pretty clear to see it's better not to marry. That, number one, which more than likely, in looking at this, it very well could be that if the wife knew that this is what's going on, she would very likely say, okay, let's go. Many times a mate will use the other mate as an excuse when there actually is no excuse. I've had that happen where I was talking, there's a brother and sister and they weren't attending as they should have been. Like they were missing several assemblies and hardly saw them for Bible class. And so at one point I ran into the wife somewhere and was talking to her and was encouraging her. It's like, we'd love to have you guys come to Bible class. You should really come because when we're all growing and you're not there to grow with us. Well, her response was, well, I would come, but my husband, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, that's not really an excuse. You can still come. And then a short time later, I ended up running into the husband somewhere out in public. And I said to him, it's like, yeah, I ran into your wife, however long ago and encouraged her to come to Bible class, and we'd love to see you guys there. And guess what his excuse was?
The wife.
Well, I would come, but my wife, blah, 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 blah. Well, I can see some of that right here, where this man is making an excuse where there really is no excuse. Where it's just like, okay, I've married, so what? Bring your wife.
Mm-hmm.
What's the big deal? But we're seeing that in these types of situations, so there again, being very careful as to who you choose, you're actually going to spend the rest of your life with. Or we're both going to be focused on what we need to focus on. So here clear example is where it'd be better not to marry, but if you are married, then it should not interfere with you serving God. So even though we don't find ourselves in that present distress, we're still finding that same application, because there are plenty of things that can distract us to where we end up making excuses as to why we shouldn't do something for the kingdom. Plenty of things that get in the way and remove us from greater responsibilities that we have because of these others that are here. So going back to chapter 7, verse 30. He talks about those that are married, so they being unmarried, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. So here's the full context of it, where he says, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, it remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. So these are all things that are here for us to consume, and things for us to use. But in the present distress, Paul is illustrating them as points. These are things that are not to consume us in the midst of what is happening. There's nothing wrong with buying. There's nothing wrong with selling. There's nothing wrong with weeping. There's nothing wrong with rejoicing. I mean, even Philippians chapter 4, Paul says to them, rejoice. So is that a contradiction here, or what are we dealing with?
Don't let any of this consume you.
All right.
All you're doing is buying and selling and wanting to possess or use the world to bring yourself up in the world, which all this just goes along with 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 through 17, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. If you're putting all that first, well, the world is passing away, and it's really close with them right now because of this distress. So that's really it. Don't put anything over, which goes along with the marriage. Don't put anything over God.
Right.
That's my answer.
All right. And that would be it. Anything to add?
Oh no, I like his answer.
Okay. You're inhaling like I thought you were about to expound.
Oh no. I was just listening to what he's saying because that's exactly what I'm seeing here.
Okay.
And he gets to say it for me, and I don't have to talk.
All right.
Except for now, I'm talking, and I want to shut up.
So that's it. Recognizing the seriousness of this situation, and get up and meet your responsibilities. I mean, okay, there's nothing wrong with weeping, but we're in the midst of something. You got to get up and get your act together. There's nothing wrong with rejoicing, just recreation, enjoying yourself. But it's just like, hey, we are in the midst of something serious. You need to get your act together.
Mm-hmm.
Is what's being presented. So here's the point. In view of stress and strain, we are not to abuse being married, responsibilities of work, and the things of this world to try to remove us from what is really important. And that's ultimately what would end up happening with this idea of rejoicing, weeping, those that possess as though they possess not. What would keep you? Let's say persecution's coming in on the church. What would keep you from leaving?
My guitars.
All right. I've got my stuff.
Yeah.
Man, forget about your stuff. And it's just like, the other brethren that we've been praying for and hope that they grow a little bit more. I've got chickens and goats. Bring your chickens and your goats with you. Or sell them and buy some more when you get here. That right there is a prime example of what we're talking about here as not abusing it. That's an abuse to where you are trying to alleviate and to remove yourself from your real responsibilities and that of the kingdom. For the fashion of this world passes away. It's passing away anyway, so what about your stuff? I mean, Jesus already said, Matthew chapter 6, what's going to happen to it?
Where your treasure is. It's
All
that
right.
one. It's that one. I
Yeah,
can't
that's
remember
it.
now.
But what did he say?
Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Man can't serve God and man.
Okay,
Sort of.
but I'm talking about, but he says specifically about your possessions. What's going to happen to them? You know it?
Christina, help your brother out. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
You going?
No one can serve two masters.
All right, you going?
Oh, man. It's going away.
While your treasures are here on earth, men break through and steal. Rust doth corrupt.
Mm-hmm. Here it is. Don't store up for yourself treasures in heaven where neither. Hold on, let's go back. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Yeah.
Then again, it brings up the denominational world who say there's going to be paradise earth, and,
Yeah.
and so I'm like, these are scriptures I go to when I'm talking to people about.
And then you have the Jehovah's Witness say that they would rather, I don't want to be in heaven with them. I want to be down here with my wife, till on the ground still.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just
ever talk to them?
Yes, I
When they
have.
say that.
And it's just, and that is ridiculous because, okay, I mean, we have natural laws here on earth. I think it's the second law of thermodynamics that says that everything is moving to a state of decay. Nothing lasts forever. I mean, the things that we have, okay, they're here, but what's going to happen with wear and tear? Stuff is going to give out. And we even see it with our physical bodies. We're young, we're spry, but then we continue to grow older, and wear and tear comes in. It's just like, okay, everything around us is pointing to the fact that it's going to end. So how should we use the things of this world? Okay, use them, but do not abuse them. Recognize that here are things that belong to this world, and view them in light of eternity. Okay, these things are not going to last forever, so I don't need to focus on that. Think of them and use them, but the principle of our lives being lived in view of eternity. And in doing so, we'll have our priorities right. That's ultimately what Paul is trying to illustrate. This time of distress is definitely a point in time where you need to have your priorities in line. And even Jesus said, a man that loves father or mother more than me is not
Worthy?
Worthy, thank you. And it was a W, but willing was the only word that was coming. Is not worthy to follow me. Okay, what about my mother and father? All right, I love them. But not to the point where I'm going to stick around and lose my soul for them. What about my wife? All right, I love my wife, but I'm not going to lose my soul for my wife. And I would say, I would hope it'd be the same thing, for her. Mm-hmm. And that's what's being laid down here. And in view of this present distress where you could die tomorrow, you better make sure you have the priorities in line. So, should it not be primary in our lives? When we think about, responsibilities and priorities that we have, should it not be primary in our lives? Make some application here. Striving to study every day. All right, yeah. So then what do I not need in turn, or need to turn around and start trying to do? I do not need to start trying to turn around and start abusing these things that are in the world to remove me from what my priority and what a good thing I should be involved in doing. But just as we said, we're not in the present distress, but just consider the pressure that we face on a daily basis. And they keep us from doing what we know we ought to do. Needing to study, needing to pray, needing to talk to so and so. And we let the things of this world, things of this life, take the forefront. Where Paul is saying, okay, they have their place, and certainly when it comes to like our jobs and our relationships and different obligations that we put on us, okay, they have their place, and we need to be involved in them. They're good for us, but they're not needing to be abused to where this is just where we get to be consumed by them. We use them for their purpose, but we do not allow them to consume us. Verse 32, he goes on and states another advantage of single life. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. If it is possible for one to remain single in view of the circumstances, this is the choice to make. But even with that, we still have been presented to us that both groups must have their priorities right. Okay, if you're a single person, you still need to put your sights on the kingdom and do what you can for the kingdom. Because a single person can still abuse the things of this world just as much as a married person can. And using their freedoms that they have to be able to just up and go and do what they want to consume that upon their own desires. Verse 33, but he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. Now, Paul is not saying, or what Paul is presenting is that, okay, yes, this is here, but this is not to be done to the neglect of serving God. This goes back to the earlier section of chapter 7 about separating for a time, and that for prayer and fasting, and then to come back together so the devil doesn't take opportunity because of your incontinency. The only way that's going to be possible is if both parties have their priorities right. But if a husband takes a wife or a wife takes a husband and she wants to start being jealous because, okay, he's doing all this church stuff and not spending time with me, then that couple needs to have a conversation. And it needs to be a situation of, well, why aren't you coming with me? This isn't evangelism. Whatever we're doing for the sake of the kingdom is not just men's work. Women can be involved in that. And to where, like I've had in Virginia, different brothers try to use their kids as an excuse as to why they don't have Bible studies or get involved in certain things. And it's just like, bring your kids. Who says your kids can't come? I mean, my little brother and I were being drugged to Bible studies all the time. And part of that was because, well, there's going to be another little kid that's there. So you go and play with them while we're having this Bible study. And it's just like, why don't we think of things that way? Like actually use doing church stuff or doing things related to the Bible and related to the kingdom as, okay, this is family time. And it's just because, like, it's going back to the point. Rejoicing and weeping. Well, no, that's not family time. And it should be. And the greatest problem that, a lot of the congregations Brotherhood is having is that they do not see biblical things as actually being fun, productive, family involvement and quality time together. It's, let's go see a movie or go out and do this, which, as we said, it's fine. But don't abuse it. To where it's just like, okay, this is what we're doing all the time. And not being involved in these other things. Let's see. Okay, so back to this point. Paul here saying, okay, so here we have the differences between the two. The single person can come and go, do as they please. Well, you need to be putting that time and energy towards serving of the kingdom. Husband and a wife, they have responsibilities to one another that the single person is not having to involve themselves in. But even though you have these extra responsibilities, you're not needing to leave the kingdom out of that equation and the responsibilities that you have. So, single person can come and go as they please. Married people, they have to consider others. All right, I have a mate or I have children. So Paul is saying there is a danger to cause one not to serve God as he ought, and that's for both of these parties. Thus, an importance of carefulness in selecting a mate, to where it comes down to, okay, we can have quality time together while we are engaging in spiritual activities. But even then, so as we're saying, it's a matter of striving to strike up a balance between the two. If a family has already made plans on, let's just say something just pops up, like, okay, a Bible study just pops up, and I call Jordan to see if he wants to go. And I get him on the phone, and Jordan says, well, no, we've already, made plans to go here or there. Okay, fine. I'm not going to be upset with that, because this is something that's just popped up out of the blue. But if we start trying to plan something out, like, okay, here's something that's going to take place, a little bit further down the road, then okay, I need to start moving things around if I can, to where that takes precedent. And like, there's a lot of problem with this when it comes to, like, especially with preachers that are in a full-time position. They end up getting themselves so involved in the affairs of the church and the matters of the church, to the neglect of their own family, to where they end up losing their family. And that doesn't help anybody. And okay, you're doing all these things for the kingdom, but then you haven't saved your own household. There's the danger that lies in all of this. To where, all right, God has given us this, but if we're coming into this, then we need to realize that God is at the center of it. And if God is at the center for both parties, then there really shouldn't be any issue. There shouldn't be any problem, because there's going to be an appreciation from both parties as to what's happening and what's actually being done. And in this distress, it'll be easy to be married if both people have a focus on serving God. So you need to remember verse 5 that we discussed earlier. Defraud you not one the other, except to be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Okay, both of us have this on our minds. So what about us making this, okay, let's set aside this time to where we're going to do this. All right, no problem. There's not going to be kicking and screaming coming from either party. That even though they have physical needs, what takes the priority? So there again, we're going back to not abusing this world's goods. So verse 34. There's a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, but that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Which brings up another thought for young people. While young people are lacking in responsibilities, they ought to take a greater advantage so as to be able to develop spiritually. And that's a great opportunity that's given to them. All right? You don't have a wife, don't have a husband, you don't have children, you don't have bills, don't have to go out and, work yourself to death. So what should you be doing? That's the time to start developing yourself spiritually, not when you get older and your time is limited. And there again is another area where our brotherhood is lacking, because many of our brethren have their children wrapped up in public school, and then while they're at school, they're involved in extra curricular activities, playing sports and whatever else.
Frisbee.
It's like, how do you have any time to study? Or let alone for your schoolwork, what time do you have to study your Bible? You don't. And yet, the idea is, well, I want my child to be able to develop and be, well-rounded. Well-rounded what? Like the rest of the heathens that they're hanging out with? No, it's going to be better. The unmarried woman care for the Lord that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. Now's the time that I should be taking to develop, to actually start growing. So that when my time is limited, I'll actually already be way past the curve. Or way ahead of the curve. Verse 35. And this I speak, notice, for your own profit. And that's a crucial point for all of us to take into consideration when it comes to receiving spiritual advice or spiritual counsel. That is, what's being presented to us is not just to control us or to have somebody getting into our business. This is being done for your profit. And certainly with what Paul is dealing with, I mean, matters of marriage, marrying, not marrying, and whatever, man, that's some personal stuff you're getting into. It's for your profit. You can take it or leave it. But we ought to appreciate that somebody is so concerned about us that they would try to give some type of counsel on this, on this event. So he says, this is for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord, notice, without distraction. Here's what it's all about. Not trying to lay down any regulations so as to be binding. Just trying to fix out or flesh out that which is comely, good in appearance, and that which is actually going to be a benefit to where you can do these things without distraction. And how many distractions do we have through this life?
Lots.
Tons.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, how hard it's going to be to get people to learn this and to be it, considering all the stuff that we have distracting us in the world nowadays. Like back then, there wasn't all this stuff.
Right.
And that was hard for them. Now look at us. So is any of us going to make it? It seems like, right?
So we actually ought to take greater heed to this warning than what they were actually being told about. Constantly having things thrown in our face, and even Jesus presented it in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 22. The light of the body is the eye, if therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. Staying focused on the target, on the task at hand. And to where it comes, it just boils down to, okay, if we're involved in something comes up, just being able to say no. There's nothing wrong with telling somebody no. If I've got something on my plate and somebody else wants to try to call up and ask a question or talk about this, I just have to tell them, no, I can't do it right now. We'll have to see about certain. I hate that this phrase is targeted this way. We'll have to circle back to it. You not get it? Anyways.
You're funny, Mike.
And just keeping first things first. Staying focused on things of the kingdom, things which are spiritual, and these other areas that come in, it's just like, well, now I don't need to worry about that right now. It's fine. In Luke chapter 10, verse 39, we have another illustration of this with Mary and Martha, where here is Jesus in their very midst, teaching to them, and Martha comes and she said a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word, but Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. Now, Martha's involved in a good thing. I mean, that's what is supposed to be going on in the house. You have guests in the house, you take care of the guests. But in view of what is actually happening, it would be better for Martha to just leave that alone. And it's like, okay, man, the master teacher is here. I'm going to go sit down and listen. And when it's time to eat, okay, then we'll start getting this stuff together. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things. Now that's exactly what Paul just said. I would have you without carefulness. I would have it that you would not be troubled. I would have it that you would serve the Lord without distraction. Tons of distractions around, where we got to try to weed through them and remove ourselves from them. Now, verse 36. We're going to try to move through the rest of this a little bit faster. Here are some cultural circumstances that are going to come up. Verse 36. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. So a father allowing his daughter to marry in the present distress. Now here we have a circumstance where parental guidance is going to have to majorly come into play because of the circumstances and the turmoil and the unrest that's all around. I don't know that young people are going to make the best decisions. To where a father or the parents would have to step in and say, look, in view of the present distress and what's happening, that we might actually have to leave the city, you don't need to marry this person. And if you make that decision, Paul is saying, okay, you haven't done anything wrong. So I can see, some people wanting to cause a fuss about that, well, you're just being cruel and whatever, unkind, so on and so forth. Paul says, no, he behaves himself, he does not behave himself uncomely. If she's going to stay, then let her stay and let him take care of it, or take care of her. But he ends up saying, let them marry. So as to avoid impurity, let them come together. So that's going back to the previous section that he'd already discussed. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart, that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So in the previous circumstance, fine, let them marry. But now, if the father is being steadfast, having no necessity, that she stay at home, then all right. It's not necessary to let them marry. The idea of keeping the virgin, that he will keep his virgin, is the idea that he's going to care for her basic necessities. House, clothes, food, I'm going to take all that responsibility on. In view of everything that's happening, you just need to stay where you are, stay in, whatever place in which you're called, stay there. For the time being. Verse 38, so then he that giveth her in marriage doth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doth better. So here again, Paul is laying out the illustration that one is in fact preferred. One is better than the other. But he is giving them the place and the room to where they can choose. So that goes back to our earlier discussion. Though Paul is an apostle, he is allowing the people to make decisions where it is a matter of choice. Now, it's unfortunate that throughout our brotherhood, many of our brethren don't allow that to happen. You have the anti-group that said, well, you got to have it this way or not. One loaf, one cup, no Bible classes, anti-cooperation, so on and so forth. And it's just like, no. We have a choice as to what we want our assemblies to look like. And you have a choice as to what you want your assemblies to look like. So make your own choices. And here Paul is illustrating that. If you do this, fine. Or if you do this, okay, it's fine too. But what that's going to take is that's going to take some understanding on all parts that everything is not going to be a yes or no answer. Well, is this better or is this better? It could very well be the case that it's even. And that whatever we end up choosing to take place, that's what ends up taking place. So it goes back to our previous discussion last Sunday about if something happened in this country and a war broke out and you guys decided to go fight and I didn't. All right, that's a choice that both parties will have to make. And hopefully we'll be in a position to where we can realize, okay, this isn't anything doctrinal, anything that's going to cost us our souls, to where we can say to each other, okay, that's fine. And not end up causing a huge split and a divide where there's not one that's necessary or unnecessary. Verse 39, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Now, the first part of verse 39 has already been stated, or actually, I guess not. I think Romans, the letter to the Romans comes after the letter to Corinthians. But here you have the same thing being stated in Romans as being stated here in Corinth. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. All right, but what if her husband be dead?
She can remarry.
She's at liberty to be married to whom she will.
It has to be to a Christian, right? Is that what that's saying?
Okay, here we go. Is that what it's saying?
Or is it better to be married to a Christian?
All right. So some will say, if she will remarry, to marry only a Christian. Now, some go so far as to say that it would be sinful to marry a non-Christian based upon this. It says very clearly, only marry in the Lord. But there's a problem with that.
Okay.
Huh?
Okay.
Oh, okay. What has Jesus already, or excuse me, well, Jesus did say it because Paul's inspired. But what has Paul already said about a person that marries an unbeliever?
That's all right.
Okay. He's already said earlier in the chapter it's not a sin. So how can we now get down here to verse 39 and it's become a sin?
I don't think it's actually saying that per se. I'm thinking it's more of a suggestion in a sense, because if you're on the same page, then it's easier to work toward God as opposed to starting over and working with a non-Christian.
Okay, and so I see what you're saying. That the preferred thing would be that if you are going to marry a Christian. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. Yeah, you're not going to the other extreme that I illustrated, to where some would say that it's a sin for them to marry a non-Christian. But what about this? This phraseology about only in the Lord. All throughout this discussion, we had Paul using what kind of statements?
Only the Lord didn't command.
Okay, the Lord did command. Yeah. The Lord didn't command. I'm giving commandment. I'm giving advice, so on and so forth. So now, when we come down here to where he says, only in the Lord, what's that going to mean?
So saith the Lord.
All right, it's got to be a marriage that's going to fall into the parameters of what Jesus has said. The idea, so even here, some would look at this as being an extra category. Well, here Paul is talking about a wife that was married, now that's still not right, because early in the chapter he's dealt with widows. So this is still all the same. Certainly we understand that it is a preferred thing if you're a Christian to marry a Christian. To marry a non-Christian is very unwise, because you're going to run into problems, going to run into miscommunications and misunderstandings, and they're not going to appreciate the spiritual things like what you're going to appreciate. But when we get to this when we get to this section here about only in the Lord, it means only by what the Lord has dictated.
So I guess I kind of see it a different way now that I'm looking at it. And now what you're saying is, because there could be somebody that's already been married before, and they might have had a wrong divorce, and you can't marry somebody that has been married before.
There you go. That is an area where this person, it says that she can marry whomever she will. Yes. Oh, really?
Right.
I can marry anybody I will?
Marry an adulterer?
I can marry an adulterer? No. You can't marry that person, only in the Lord. Only is how the scriptures are prescribed. Now, here's where what's another passage that some will try to tack onto this one? to kind of bolster up that position. Only in the Lord. Only a Christian. And I think your mom, I think Jamie actually brought it up last week. Not in this connection, but she brought it up in a different point.
I was thinking, are you? Oh, did you have that?
Yeah, 2 Corinthians 6:14.
That sounds good.
Oh yeah, that's what I was just looking at.
Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness? But there's a problem with this.
And you can't do it ever.
All right, that's right. You couldn't do it ever, which Paul has already said. No, it's fine. On top of that, this context is not dealing with marriage. Nowhere in chapter 6 of the second letter is marriage anywhere mentioned. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. So this is verse 17 of verse 14. This is what you're needing to do. So what have we just done? If 14 is talking about marriage, not being unequally yoked, and then Paul goes a step further and says, all right, come out from among them, be ye separate. If this was/is sinful, then we have another reason for divorce. But that's not what's being talked about. Paul says the marriage is sanctified. He's already taught that. It's acknowledged of God, and the children, he says, are clean. So though Paul discusses the danger of marrying a non-Christian, what's being going on here in that 13-14, where that's being mentioned, what's happening is this is an adverbial phrase. The verb marry modifies only in the Lord or guided by the Lord. To marry in a Christian manner. So emphasis is on the woman's motives. It's not a thing of, okay, if you're going to marry, then marry in the Lord. Okay, we understand that is preferred. But we've just gone through all of this discussion where the other is going to be allowed. To where we're going to get to the end of Paul's writing in this section, and all of a sudden start looking at it as, well, no, now it's sinful. And then to take 2 Corinthians 6:14 and tack that along to it and say, well, now you got to get out of it. No, that's not what's happening. If you're going to marry, make sure you're marrying in accordance with what the Lord has said. And to take all of these things into consideration. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. So even in verse 40, what do we have being illustrated? He is further illustrating, all right, this is counsel. This is advice that I'm giving. So what about verse 39? If you're going to marry, only in the Lord. Marry in accordance with his counsel and what he has legislated. But if you're not, he says, happier is she if she so abide, single as I am. But again, he says, after my judgment, after my advice, because of what's happening, because of what we're going through. And so we already dealt with, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Which, as Adrian said it clearly, he does. Able to work miraculous gifts, able to impart, lay hands on individuals and have them receive miraculous gifts. So it's very clear that even though this is after his judgment, he's giving this judgment after or in accordance with how this Spirit would give advice on this issue. And that's all for chapter 7. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Anything not clear? Need to be cleared up?
1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7, for we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either.
All right.
But the rest of it is really good, but we can save it. Yeah, I gotta deal with my kid.
I can't take my MR2 with me.
Oh boy.
Well, my kids were joking around.